Hello everyone, welcome back. I am Kris. We're going to break this down into two parts before we get started. Pop this up. This is Battle of Gettysburg, 1863, American Civil War documentary. This is by Kings and Generals. Before we get started, if you can click that thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. Easy, you saw how fast it happened. Helps me out. If you want to donate to the channel, there's a thanks button. Click on that, donate, and then request a video. And your name sponsors that video when I do it. It's my way of saying thank you. This is going to be two parts, about 20 minutes or so. Well, I don't want to break it down there. I'll probably break it to 17. And the next one will be a little bit longer. But that's okay. Let's get into it. Oh, by the way, for anyone, I was at Gettysburg. Did not see the whole thing. I saw more of the Union fishhook. It's a fantastic place to go to. Sad.
Chancellorsville had been Robert E. Lee's masterstroke, but heavy casualties and the death of Stonewall Jackson reduced a great victory into a Pyrrhic one. Worse, his supply situation was collapsing, and he was under pressure to help the deteriorating situation out west. It was clear that the Confederacy was losing the war. Thus, Lee concluded that another northern invasion was the South's best and perhaps final chance to win the war. This decision would embark the Confederacy's most iconic general on a path towards perhaps the most iconic engagement ever fought on American soil, the Battle of Gettysburg. Every week we release 3 new exclusive and many Russian Revolution been long of it. Please fall on test of our pages for allowing us. Potomac returned to its encampment job. Joseph Hooker's Army of the Potomac returned to its encampments near Fredericksburg by May 10th, and the Army of Northern Virginia reoccupied their fortifications almost as if Chancellorsville hadn't happened. Both armies required rest, reorganization, and replenishment, but only one would finish rebuilding before the next campaign began.
I've said it before, but I love to tell it. So there used to be not soldiers. In every encampment, there would be sometimes wives or ladies of the night, prostitutes, shall we say, that when the soldiers would get paid, they would pay to have sex with the women. Got a cough, excuse me, I muted it before. Okay, so they would spend their money with the ladies, and Hooker had a lot more women because he didn't care so much. Kept his men happy, so the camp was allowed to have more ladies follow, and those women were all about making money, so he allowed more of those women to follow. Those ladies who took money in lieu of sexual favors were known as Hooker's gals. It was later shortened to hooker or hookers, which is another word for prostitute. So if anyone wants to know how that word came about, it was because of, is it Joseph Hooker? We're going to say his name was Joseph. If it's not, he's going to change it.
Even before Chancellorsville, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and General-in-Chief Henry Halleck had hated Hooker's haughty personality and wanted him replaced. However,
Edwin Stanton, good man.
Hooker's dispatches let him shift the blame for the defeat. Both John Sedgwick and George Stoneman had clearly failed to carry out their orders, for which Stoneman was dismissed from cavalry command, while the 11th Corps commander, O.O. Howard, hadn't heeded Hooker's warning about Jackson's flank attack. President Lincoln acknowledged that Hooker's subordinates had failed him and allowed him to retain command. In exchange, Lincoln demanded Hooker attack again, which he refused. The Army of the Potomac was normally 120,000 men strong, but only had 75,000 ready for duty. It suffered 20,000 casualties during the Chancellorsville campaign, and 35,000 enlistments had expired, with the troops returning home. At the current replenishment rate, it would only be back to 90,000 by June. Recruiting was done by the states, and many were having trouble filling their quotas. Generous monetary bonuses kept the volunteers coming, with additional incentives offered to re-enlist veterans, but they weren't coming fast enough. Many states resorted to calling up militia regiments, but they only served for a few months before heading home. In response, Lincoln authorized the recruitment of African American soldiers, starting with the 54th Massachusetts, and Congress enabled states to begin drafting soldiers via the Enrollment Act. However, these were long-term solutions, and in the short term, Hooker's army would remain under strength. Meanwhile, Lee was conflicted. On the one hand, Chancellorsville had convinced him that his army was invincible. On the other, the Confederacy was in crisis. While both sides' draft laws allowed men to hire substitutes or pay to avoid serving, the Confederacy included numerous exemptions for the planter class. Consequently, the already limited food supply collapsed as poor farmers were hauled off to fight. Their wives were now leading bread riots across southern cities, and desertion was rising. The non-slaveholding majority were questioning fighting for the privileged few's interests when they wouldn't fight themselves. Worse, the Western theater was collapsing. Ulysses S. Grant had crossed the Mississippi and was bearing down on Vicksburg, while Nathaniel Banks marched on Port Hudson. If either fortress fell, the Red and Mississippi rivers would be lost, and with them, Texas's critical supplies of horses and beef. Joseph Johnston and Jefferson Davis thus asked Lee to send reinforcements west to save the situation. Lee refused as he didn't believe he could intervene in time. The Yankees only needed to take one fortress to close both rivers to the Confederacy. The limited Confederate rail network was already severely overtaxed, and the most direct route to Mississippi was exposed to Federal raids. Reinforcements had to travel a more circuitous route, followed by a long march to reach either city, almost certainly arriving too late. Instead, Lee would reinvade the North. An invasion might draw away Federal troops from Mississippi, and more pressingly, looting northern supplies was the only option to feed his army. There was nothing left in the South. Additionally, moving the war out of Virginia for the summer would allow the farmers to get a crop sown and harvested, alleviating the food problem. It would also provide some time to fix damaged infrastructure.
Sorry, I had to let a dog out. Back to the video.
Moreover, Lee was convinced that an invasion of the North was a war-winning strategy. Lord Palmerston was still open to recognizing the Confederacy, but he needed a decisive victory to overcome British public opinion. Additionally, Lee believed that Northern morale was nearing collapse. Both sides read the other's newspapers, but for unknown reasons, Lee only received anti-war Copperhead papers, which wildly exaggerated Northern war weariness, material shortages, and desire for peace. Consequently, Lee incorrectly believed that the Union war effort was as close to collapse as the Confederacy's. Therefore, a victory on Northern soil would finally win international recognition and force the war to end.
That makes sense as to why he went north. He was only reading the information that he wanted to hear instead of all of it. That makes a lot more sense. I always understood why he wanted to go north. I mean, that makes perfect sense. You want to go north and loop around and threaten Washington from the north. Sure, that makes a lot of sense. But just like in today, if you're only listening to what you want to hear, then you're never going to get the whole story. That I did not know. That's fascinating.
First, Lee had to reorganize his army. New conscripts brought his strength up to 75,000, but Stonewall Jackson was irreplaceable, and his command had to be split into two new corps. Jackson's subordinates, Richard Ewell and A.P. Hill, would command the 2nd and new 3rd Corps respectively, alongside James Longstreet's 1st Corps. Unfortunately, both men were used to Jackson's highly detailed and specific orders and struggled to adjust to Lee's vague directives. Worse, Lee didn't actually speak English, but a dialect called Southern Gentleman, which replaced entire paragraphs of dialogue with meaningful pauses, glances, and aristocratic bearing. Longstreet and Jackson understood this dialect and heard the details and intentions Lee left unsaid, but Hill and Ewell didn't. Consequently, they frequently misunderstood Lee's orders. Lee had to reach Pennsylvania this time.
If we're not talking the same language, then how are we supposed to all be on board with the plans, the goals? If Lee talks to people. I didn't know this either. But if Lee's talking to people, he has to be able to convey the message that he wants. Other people can pick up on, you can start and they kind of understand. They're like, okay, we're all on the same page. Boom, boom, boom. But you have to make sure that everyone you communicate with understands that message. I didn't know this either. The Southern gentleman thing does make sense, though, because they all wanted to be Southern gentlemen.
So he planned to move faster and in greater secrecy than during the Maryland campaign. The army would quietly slip away from Fredericksburg before clearing and then moving up the Shenandoah Valley to hide the march. From there, they would spread out into Pennsylvania, acquiring supplies. Once the Union Army engaged, his forces would rapidly reconcentrate to win the decisive battle. Ewell began slipping away on June 3rd. The next day, Federal sentries reported movement in the rebel camp. Hooker cancelled everyone's leave and ordered the army to prepare for action on June 5th. Sedgwick launched a reconnaissance in force that night, which found weakened but still formidable Confederate defenses, and withdrew with prisoners for the Bureau of Military Information. Their interrogation yielded little intelligence beyond confirming parts of the army were moving. On June 6th, John Buford reported Confederate cavalry in Culpeper County. The BMI confirmed that J.E.B. Stuart was concentrating his forces, while Lee appears to be moving southwest toward Richmond.
Culpeper County. Excuse me. I'm eating chips with hummus. It's delicious. And I'm drinking. So what do you expect? In fact, Culpeper County was the Culpeper was the name of the spy ring under George Washington, and that was because he did all of his surveying in Culpeper County. Now you know. This is where the dun 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 dun. There you go.
Fearing a major raid, Hooker dispatched the Cavalry Corps, now under Alfred Pleasonton, and riding in two wings with infantry support to confront Stuart. At 04:30 on June 9th, Buford crossed the Rappahannock at Beverly's Ford, surprising and scattering rebel vedettes in the dense fog. He'd stumbled onto Stuart's camp, which was alerted by the gunfire. The nearest brigade lurched out of bed onto unsaddled horses to engage, delaying Buford long enough for Stuart's horse artillery to position itself on knolls and open fire. As the Confederates began drawing up around the guns, the 6th Pennsylvania charged them near St. James Church, only to be driven off with heavy casualties. Buford's men dismounted and attempted to turn the Confederate flank with carbine fire, only for the rebels to unexpectedly withdraw. Gregg's division had arrived from Kelly's Ford, threatening the rebel flank on Fleetwood Hill. Stuart hurriedly redeployed, moved in reinforcements, and repelled Gregg's attack. A cycle of charges and countercharges, supported by artillery, ensued until the Federals withdrew near sunset. While tactically a Confederate victory, Brandy Station was the first time Federal cavalry had matched the Confederates in skill and determination. This disturbed Stuart, as his troopers' elan was their only advantage. Previously, the Federals had only won cavalry engagements through overwhelming numbers or surprise. Seeing them finally match the Confederates' skill destroyed his men's confidence, which Stuart would do anything to revive. With more reports coming in of Confederates moving west, Hooker proposed moving on Richmond's weakened defenses, but Lincoln refused. Instead, Hooker was ordered to find and destroy Lee's army. Lincoln was now convinced that Hooker taking Richmond was equivalent to Howe taking Philadelphia rather than Napoleon taking Vienna, and therefore strategically irrelevant. However, Hooker didn't know where Lee was, as Pleasonton couldn't get past Stuart. On June 14th, word reached Hooker that Ewell had attacked the Winchester garrison, who'd ignored warnings from Halleck to withdraw at the first sign of Confederates. Lee was clearly moving into the Shenandoah Valley, but his objective was still unknown. Still, he had to respond, and Hooker ordered the army to march for Manassas Junction, which held the crossroads to wherever Lee was heading. Stuart's cavalry screen continued blocking Pleasonton's attempts to uncover Lee's movements, and Ewell began crossing the Potomac near Williamsport on June 15th, deliberately avoiding Harper's Ferry garrison. Ewell quickly moved on to Hagerstown, while Longstreet and Hill crossed near Sharpsburg on the 17th, with all generals sending out foraging parties as they advanced.
I believe this is Boonesboro right here. That was started by Daniel Boone, I believe. Could be wrong, has nothing to do with this video.
Lee gave strict orders not to loot, but to pay for all supplies with Confederate money or Army promissory notes, which were worthless and less than worthless, respectively. Many Northerners complained that it felt worse than being robbed. Lee entered Pennsylvania on June 22nd, and the alarm was raised. Meanwhile, Hooker was still near Manassas Junction, uninformed about Lee's movements. Stuart had thwarted Pleasanton's latest attempts to find Lee the previous day, before disappearing himself. Hooker ordered Pleasanton to scour the countryside for rebels, while gradually shifting the army north as a precaution. Stuart received verbal orders from Lee on June 22nd to defend the right flank. However, Lee's vagueness gave Stuart enough interpretation room to go adventuring. To that end, he would reassert Confederate cavalry dominance and ride around the Army of the Potomac again to rebuild his troopers' confidence. Taking his best brigades while the rest screened Lee, Stuart departed on June 25th, intending to circle the Federal Army, frighten Washington, D.C., and then rejoin Lee before he was missed. However, word of Lee in Pennsylvania finally reached Hooker the same day, and he ordered his men north in earnest to catch Lee. While Stuart successfully made it around Hooker, capturing supplies and damaging infrastructure, he found his route back to Lee blocked by Union soldiers. Worse, Judson Kilpatrick's cavalry division, particularly George Custer's Michigan Brigade, caught his scent and pursued. Stuart realized that he'd have to ride far harder and further north than planned to regroup with Lee. The Army of the Potomac marched rapidly, with Buford in the lead, followed by John Reynolds' First Corps, with Frederick as the rendezvous point. Halleck tried to tempt Lee back to Virginia with a raid on Richmond's outskirts, but it wasn't threatening enough. Meanwhile, Hooker was fighting with Halleck about reinforcements, and impetuously wired Lincoln that if the Harper's Ferry garrison wasn't assigned to him, he'd immediately resign. Lincoln accepted on June 27th. The first choice to replace Hooker was Reynolds, widely regarded as the best general in the army. He declined, and at the recommendation of other senior generals, command passed to George Meade on June 28th as the army reached Frederick. While his men fearfully called him Old Snapping Turtle behind his back, Meade's troops had always fought better than other units. Everyone hoped
Meade was a good general. He really was. He was just a different kind of guy. You know, his old snapping turtle. Well, he was still good. Fought hard. And he also knew Lee, which was a big thing coming into Gettysburg. Robert E. Lee had faced so many different generals that he knew. And he knew Meade as well. The thing is, Meade read him better than Lee anticipated or expected in Gettysburg. Grant knew Lee from the Mexican-American War. Lee vaguely knew him. He did know him, vaguely knew him, because he was more of a, well, this isn't about Grant, but Grant was not a leader like Lee was in the Mexican-American War. He was a, he arranged for the supply chains and stuff like that, and did a lot of other things. So he got to see how other generals fought, which, fortunately for the Union, worked out for Grant, and Lincoln did not work out for Lee.
That Meade could similarly motivate the army to defend his home state. That night, Longstreet's personal spy, Henry Harrison, warned him that the Federals were quickly closing. Longstreet rushed to inform Lee, who was furious that Stuart hadn't warned him. His army was spread from Chambersburg to the outskirts of Harrisburg, skirmishing with militia, holding towns to ransom, purchasing supplies, and kidnapping hundreds of free African Americans into slavery. He immediately issued orders to concentrate at Cashtown. Henry Heath's division from Hill's Corps was first to arrive on June 29th, but he heard that there were supplies, including shoes, in the nearby town of Gettysburg, the crossroad of every road in southern Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, Meade settled into command. On June 30th, he made headquarters in Taneytown, before issuing orders to advance towards Gettysburg, the natural place to concentrate an army. He also began preparing positions along Big Pipe Creek as a fallback position. Heath ordered Pettigrew's brigade to Gettysburg to investigate the supply rumors. As Pettigrew arrived, Buford arrived on high ground south of town. Pettigrew reported the Federals to Heath after finding nothing of value in Gettysburg. Both generals thought it was just militia, but a reconnaissance in force would be launched to be certain. Buford knew that infantry moving in enemy territory without cavalry screens meant the main body was close, and the high ground south of Gettysburg was a perfect defensive position. Knowing the hills must be denied to the rebels, Buford prepared a delaying action north of Gettysburg, then alerted Reynolds, who alerted Meade, before preparing a quick march to support Buford. At 07:30 on July 1st, Heath made first contact with Buford's vedettes astride Chambersburg Pike. Pushing through, Heath's infantry encountered Gamble's dismounted brigade in cover along Hurst Ridge. Despite being outnumbered 2,750 to 7,600, the troopers' breech-loading Sharps carbines allowed them to repel the initial probe through weight of fire. However, the rebels reformed and made a more determined push. By 10:20, Heath had pushed Gamble back to McPherson's Ridge, where Devin's brigade joined the fight. Heath still would have pushed through if not for Reynolds' timely arrival. As his men replaced Buford's exhausted troopers, Reynolds was killed by a random bullet, and Abner Doubleday took command. The Union right was pushed back before it got into position, but the left and center held as the Iron Brigade's reserve regiment counterattacked along a railroad cut, routing a Confederate brigade. Fighting paused at 11:30. Lee'd given orders to avoid a general engagement before the army concentrated, but since Heath had accidentally caused one, the rest of Hill's corps moved to support him. Meanwhile, the 11th Corps arrived as Doubleday redeployed along.
I just want to point out, it's Doubleday, not Double Dat. They're saying Doubleday. Just a little error in editing.
McPherson's and Seminary Ridge. As the senior officer, Howard took command and requested all available reinforcements move swiftly to Gettysburg. He was about to face 2/3 of the Army of Northern Virginia alone. Ewell was obliviously approaching via the Carlisle and Harrisburg roads. He simply intended to use the crossroads to reach Cashtown, but he had no idea that the battle was joined until the Federal infantry blocked his way. With Lee's orders to avoid battle now moot, Ewell prepared to attack. Rhodes' division moved into position and attacked Oak Ridge at 1400. However, the lead brigade didn't do any reconnaissance before marching into the teeth of the defenses, where they suffered devastating casualties. Lee arrived around 1430. Accepting that battle couldn't be avoided, he ordered all commands to attack. Hill's troops pushed the 1st Corps back to Seminary Ridge, with heavy casualties all around. Meanwhile, Early's division had arrived down the Harrisburg Road. The 11th Corps was overstretched, and its flank was exposed. Deploying his troops in a wider, deeper line than the entire Union position, Early first assaulted the salient on Barlow's Knoll, before shattering the 11th Corps' left flank, forcing it into a panicked retreat by 1600. Meanwhile, the 1st Corps artillery was devastating the continued Confederate attacks with concentrated double canister fire. However, as more Confederates arrived, the position became untenable, and the left was flanked by superior numbers. With the 11th Corps routing, the 1st Corps began retreating through Gettysburg at 1630.
I think I'm right there. I went a little past. All roads lead to Gettysburg. Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and stop it there. I know it's not it's the break, but I don't want to take it there and then. You know what? Yeah, we'll go to the 20-minute mark. Why not? We'll just do that. We'll break it in the middle of a segment. I don't care.
The defenders retreated to Cemetery and Culp's Hills, where the 2nd Corps commander Winfield Scott had assumed command, placing his troops on Cemetery Ridge and the 12th Corps vanguard on Culp's Hill. The survivors were ordered to occupy Cemetery Hill and start digging in. The high ground was to be held at all costs. Lee also realized the value of high ground. Accordingly, he ordered Ewell to carry the hill occupied by the enemy if he found it practicable, but to avoid a general engagement until the arrival of the other divisions of the army. Ewell looked at the steep slopes and deploying Federals, looked at his exhausted soldiers, and concluded an attack wasn't practicable. Lee meant, "Take that hill immediately, you won't be blamed for failure," but this was lost in translation from Southern gentleman to English. This critical decision dictated the rest of the Battle of Gettysburg. After dark, Hill and Ewell's corps finished arriving in Gettysburg alongside Longstreet's vanguard. During the Council of War, Lee lamented that Stuart's absence had left him without reconnaissance on Union strength and positions. Stuart had just gotten around Custer's pursuit near Carlisle that afternoon and was looking for Lee. Longstreet argued that the Federal position was too strong to attack. Instead, they should disengage and force Meade to attack them on favorable ground. However, all the other generals refused. Leaving the battlefield meant admitting defeat, which could shatter morale. Worse, Meade could ambush them on the road. They'd stay and fight tomorrow. Across the field, the 12th, 3rd and 5th Corps had all arrived, but the 6th Corps was still in Maryland and wouldn't start arriving until late tomorrow. Meade arrived after midnight. Unable to survey the battlefield, he asked Hancock about the position, who declared it the best natural defensive position in the world. The Army's chief engineer, Gouverneur Warren, agreed. The Army of the Potomac would make its stand along a fishhook of hills and ridges stretching from Culp's Hill to Little Round Top.
What makes that such a fantastic position, if you've been there, is that this is all upward sloping hill. Not like very deep. It's just this gradual rise. And you're making your opponent run up there. I want to say it's somewhere around here, maybe. Could be that right there. There's a cluster of trees. It's all on my other computer. I have to get photos transferred. But there's a cluster of trees. Let's just say it's this. Where there's a fence today. There's a fence there. I'm going to cough, excuse me. Okay. There's a cluster of trees there, and it signifies the closest, hiccup, that the Confederates got on day 3. And when you see where they were positioned to where they got, it's hairy. If you're on the Union side, that's a little too close for comfort, all being that they were firing pretty much grape shot canister, point blank range right in their face. We're going to go ahead and end this here since it's the nighttime for this battle. And we'll be back with part 2 shortly after. Hope you're going to go get your classic hummus and some chips and some alcohol. Oh, hold on. There you go. I'm back. And get ready for part 2. So until then, have a good day. Have a good night.